Hi, I'm Mike Glenn, Senior Pastor of Brentwood Baptist Church, and we're glad that you have joined us for our YouTube. It would help us a lot if you hit subscribe and like. That'll kind of tell us that we're kind of talking about things that are important to you, and of course that's important to us. Today we're doing something a little unusual. We have a guest with us. One of the great things about living in the Middle Tennessee area is there are a lot of cool people who live around us, and with a quick phone call and maybe at a cheap lunch, you can get them to hang out with you for your YouTube channel anyway. Sitting next to me is David French. David is a well-known author, columnist, writer, has written for all the major publications that you would know. He's been on most of the television shows, news television shows that you'd be familiar with, CNN, Fox News, MSNBC, so you kind of run the gamut on them. But is a well-respected and deeply reasonable voice about how we as people of faith engage our culture and what we do with it. So he's been with us today for a lunch and learn where we talked about it, but in another conversation we said, hey, here's another thing we want to talk about, and it's the issue of masculinity or the crisis of masculinity that we have in our culture right now.
Yeah.
So quickly, just so we can kind of get the parameters in here, define this crisis.
If you look at, except for the very apex of like the military and the corporate world and entertainment, if you look at regular, ordinary, everyday men in this country, they're falling behind at a tremendous rate, failing to finish school. The further you go in education, the fewer percentage of men you're often going to find.
Which is a recent change.
It is,
that has just switched in the last couple of years.
Absolutely. And then if you look at this phenomenon that a lot of people have talked about called deaths of despair, this is where Americans are killing themselves at unbelievable rates through suicide, through drug overdoses, through alcohol, and it's overwhelmingly men, and it's overwhelmingly single men who are doing this. And it's so catastrophic that American life expectancy has either been stagnant or dropped for 3 consecutive years.
Right.
And so an awful lot of people are waking up to the reality that it's almost as if we've lost or are losing the capacity to raise boys to be young men and to have a life of meaning and purpose.
Okay, so when you say crisis, I mean, we have a crisis a day, right? Okay, there's the climate crisis, there's this crisis and that crisis. So we get numb to that.
Yeah.
Okay, so is this a crisis or is this?
I really am reluctant to use words like crisis because I think the one of the biggest problems we have in our politics is everything's a crisis, right? So everyone's constantly alarmed, sometimes unjustifiably. But I think when you're losing more people to just drug overdoses on a given year than we lost in 1 year, than we lost in the whole course of the Vietnam War. And that's just one part of the deaths of despair portion of what's happening in our country. When you're talking about deaths well over 100,000, 150,000 a year, there is a segment of this country, not the whole country, but a segment of this country that is in crisis, and that segment is disproportionately centered around particularly single men.
Between the ages of?
So it would be single men in general have a real issue. Divorce, and if it's single by you've never married or divorced, interestingly, widowers have sort of less of this, face less of this crisis. So there isn't a specific age range where all of it peaks that I'm aware of across all layers.
Okay.
But we also have, in addition to this very empirical problem, we're also in the middle of a huge debate over what is virtuous masculinity itself. So that's a big cultural debate that's occurring at the same time that we have this crisis of the deaths of despair. And that, the American Psychological Association recently put out a lengthy statement on sort of toxic masculinity and tradition, and labeled many aspects of what you would call traditional masculinity, labeled them as toxic to the development of young men and boys. And that, I think, creates and fosters and continues this kind of confusion that we have in our society right now about how do you raise a boy to be a young man who lives a life of meaning and purpose? And millions of families don't have a problem with this. This is not something that afflicts all American families, but it is enough of a problem that we're seeing some of these social indicators in the larger country that are really serious.
Okay, so you say it doesn't affect everybody. Can we say can we see a pattern between those who handled it well and those who don't?
Yeah, so basically a lot of it falls along the lines of if you grew up in an intact married home, if your parents have a college education, your kids, boys and girls, are doing well. That's not to say they are not afflicted by a lot of the things that young people are afflicted by with rising anxiety and depression, but sort of where you start from point A to point B to point C, the path is pretty solid.
Right.
There are individual exceptions here and there, but educated, married families tend to do well. But what we are seeing is that families where there is a fracturing, or maybe they never fully formed in the first place. In other words, you come from a single home with a single mother and absent father, that not only are they not knitting themselves together, but that fracturing is becoming multi-generational. And that sense of disconnect from the family, loneliness, those are becoming, and then a loss of a sense of purpose. Those things are all adding together to create a class of young men and older men who don't know their place in this world.
Right. We have a young adult worship service called Kairos. And here's what I hear from the guys. They are scared to death in this culture. They feel like the entire world has turned on them, okay? They will tell you things like the only difference between a second date and a night in jail is whether or not the girl likes you. They're called toxic. If they open the door for a lady, they are frowned upon. If they don't, their grandmother yells at them. So they're constantly caught in this conflict or mash of confused expectations, of hostility.
Yeah.
With that. So what's a guy to do? Okay, we know Mike Pence was given all kind of grief because he followed the Billy Graham rule, and he won't eat with a female who is not his wife without somebody else being there. Well, as a pastor, I have followed that rule all of my career. I've always had somebody nearby if I was having some kind of meeting with a woman who was not Jeannie.
Well, as a Christian, I'm not a pastor, but I'm a Christian in public life. I follow modified versions of that as well. I think everybody sort of has different variations of it, but I've followed that as well, and that's been a very good decision that I've made in my life. And
okay, but Mike Pence was accused of holding women back. They don't have the same access.
Yes, I think that so here's the problem. I think here's one of the problems. There's sort of no course of action you can take in this society that is going to be beyond critique or reproach.
Okay.
So you're just going to have to expect that you're going to take fire. And so I hate this phrase, well, you're over the target because you're getting flack. Well, sometimes you take fire because you're being a jerk or you're doing the wrong thing. But I think a lot of it is we have to have the courage of our convictions to navigate a proper path and to navigate it even in the face of cultural headwinds. And, I think one of the things when we're talking about, so for example, the only difference between a first date, a second date and a third date, or a second date and then jail is whether the girl likes you. A lot of that is also dependent on how does a guy observe traditional forms of manners? Does a person live up to to a standard of sexual purity?
Does she feel honored?
Does she feel honored and respected?
Yes.
As opposed to sort of preyed upon? And so a lot of this is still in the control of the guy. But I think one thing that we, who especially are older men who might feel more secure in our position in life and that it's not as precarious, I think that one thing that we can do is sort of plow the way forward for younger men by defending proper exercise and modeling as much as possible as imperfect people,
Right.
masculine virtues, and also pushing back against a culture that would take masculine characteristics and make them negative. I'll give you a really good example.
Well, I hope you are following this conversation with David French with the same intensity that I am. This was a rather long discussion, so we're going to break it into two parts. You have just witnessed part one, so stay tuned for part two.